Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this morning's panel session on the UK economy. We've had this event in the diary for several weeks, if not months now, but it strikes me that more by luck than judgment, we couldn't have timed it much better. It feels like we're moving between phases in the economic response to the coronavirus pandemic. In the first phase, the economy went into lockdown. The government was focused on supporting businesses that essentially had to shut up shop, with things like business loans and the furlough schemes. Now many of those schemes are coming to an end, and the government has to figure out how to pay them. The pandemic is clear. Possibility of second lockdown, or at the very least restrictions, announces later today. We're due to have a budget in November. There is unlikely to be a vaccine this year, more likely to be next year. And in between, we have the small matter of Brexit. So the next few months is going to be time for variations. I'm delighted to say that today to discuss some of those issues facing the UK economy. They should be familiar to regular readers of the Telegraph. They are in no particular order: Allister Heath, Jeremy Warner, Juliet Samuel, and Liam Halligan. Do you think that Rishi Sunak has done a good job of managing the UK economy through this pandemic? So, as I say, if you could vote on that, click on the bar chart. Yes, no. We've got the results coming through now. It looks like overwhelmingly the answer to that is yes. Rishi Sunak has done a good job of managing the economy through this pandemic. 86, nearly 90% of people think he's done a good job. So that's what the viewers think, Telegraph readers think. Let's see what the panelists think. Jeremy, I'm going to turn to you first. Has Rishi Sunak done a good job? Has he protected the UK economy from the effects of the global pandemic and the lockdown? What do you think?
Well, I see our viewers have confirmed Rishi as the most admired member of the cabinet at the moment. I mean, that's not difficult given the shambles that's been going on over the handling of the whole coronavirus pandemic. It's also easier, obviously, for the Chancellor to perform well in a crisis. I mean, interestingly, despite all the criticisms that can be levelled at the Treasury, it tends to be good in a crisis. And this is because, obviously, it's in charge of the money and it's been showering the economy with money. There will come a point, however, where Rishi will have to go into reverse and he will not seem quite so popular when that occurs. I mean, the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October, theoretically. It's more and more obvious that that is going to have to be replaced with something as we go into a kind of lockdown light type of regime until a vaccine is discovered. So he's going to have to dish out some more money. It's going to be an incredibly delicate wire that he has to try and tread over the next 6 months or so. He's got to keep showering the economy with money. There's no doubt about that. He's got to keep his foot well down on the accelerator until economic conditions return to normal. But at the same time, he's got to give the markets some reassurance that at some stage there will be a fiscal consolidation. So he's got to pull off the old St. Augustinian trick of please make me chase, but not yet.
Juliet, can I throw the same question to you? Do you think that Rishi has done a good job, and of the various schemes that he's used to, I guess, keep the economy alive during this sort of period of stasis, what have been the most important ones?
Well, I think the furlough scheme's probably been the most important. It's certainly the one that is the most concretely affects people, that they're most familiar with, because it determines whether or not they still have a job or think they have a job and money coming into their account. And the biggest collapse we've seen in GDP, it's all private consumption, people not being able to spend money or wanting to spend money. And I agree with Jeremy that it's going to be the hardest thing for him to wind up, especially if the government is currently on a trajectory of saying to businesses who have been opening up their doors that they've now got to shut down again and, limit numbers even more and have a curfew and all that sort of thing. It's very hard to see the deal being broken, whereby the government said to the economy, essentially back in March, we will shut you down, but in return, we will support you so that there isn't unnecessary damage done to your business. And so if the government's going to say again, we're going to shut you down, then it's very hard to see how they can say, but at the same time, we're going to take away the support. So I think despite a lot of the discomfort among Conservatives at almost semi-nationalising the entire economy, it's going to continue in some form or another. And I think it has to continue, or it should continue, in the sense that part of what will determine how we come out of this crisis is to what degree the damage done to the economy is permanent and to what degree it's temporary. And the permanent damage, some of it may just be accelerated processes that were going to happen anyway, like the collapse of certain retail industries or shops and the move online. But some of it will be completely unnecessary damage that will leave us with a hangover of unemployment and debt and, small businesses going bankrupt. And that is the stuff that the government, that Rishi Sunak is trying to preserve. And so that's why I think he will feel he has to, and he does have to, keep a lot of the support going until the government stops shutting down the economy. And I think he will be able to do that in part because the Bank of England is buying all the debts. But I don't want to get too much into the fiscal side of things. So so I think he's going to have a really tough job winding this up while his cabinet colleagues are still shutting down the economy. He's got to keep spending.
Yeah. So, Liam, turning to you now, I mean, both Juliet and Jeremy seem to be saying that Sunak's done a good job, but in a way, what we've had so far has been the easy bit. Now comes the tough bit. Would you agree with that? And what are some of the tough decisions that Rishi Sunak will now have to make?
No, I do largely agree with my colleagues. Just in terms of the job he's done so far, I think there's an awful lot of fraud going on in the CBIL loans and the bounce back loans, which the National Audit Office will have a field day with in the next 6 to 12 months. On the furlough scheme, I don't think we'll move to some kind of German-style Kurzarbeit system where we seriously change. We move to a sort of more corporatist landscape, but I do think furloughing will be extended, albeit on a sector by sector basis. As Juliet pointed out, it's pretty tough for the government not to do that when it's keeping businesses locked down. I think in terms of going forward, two things that Rishi Sunak needs to do, in my view, he needs to understand that the temperament of financial markets is changing. For about a decade now, markets have demanded ever lower interest rates, ever more quantitative easing, and indeed that's been the response to this crisis too. A complete return to a sort of post-2008, 2009 situation. But financial markets now are looking at currencies more and more, and rather than looking for ever more stimulus in individual countries, they're looking for at least some signs of grown-up adult behaviour and restraint, though, as Jeremy says, not straight away. I think there's a consensus on that. So I think what Sunak needs to do, he needs to start creating a narrative countering this idea that the UK is going to go to negative nominal interest rates. We've had negative real interest rates for a long time, of course, with the interest rate being lower than the rate of inflation, but moving to sort of ECB style negative nominal interest rates. I think that would be a huge mistake, particularly when you look at the quite alarming number actually of systemically important UK banks that are trading at a price to book of 15, 20, 25%, which indicates the market thinks they're doomed. And negative nominal interest rates do harm banks' balance sheets. And the other more general point, Ben, is as well as trying to steer that narrative about central bank stimulus going forward, some, but not completely through the looking glass, he also needs to lay out a broader economic vision of where we're going, because there's an awful lot of private sector money sitting on the sidelines, not so much in financial markets, which are completely detached from economic reality. The S&P hitting ever more all-time highs in the middle of an enormous economic contraction. He needs to lay out a vision for the UK of a generally low tax economy, serious supply side reforms to get productivity up and to get growth moving as we come out of this crisis. And I've seen no sense of the vision thing from the government, but it's very, very important in times of crisis to lay out that vision.
Allister, I can come to you now. I mean, the point that Liam was making there about restraint, and clearly the main area in which the taps have been flowing has been in the amount of debt that they're running in this crisis. Is how to spend the money on the business loans. But we've obviously gone through the point where debt to GDP has gone through 100%, which a lot of people think is quite an important benchmark. How important is it nowadays? Because I'm old enough to remember when the World Bank put out a report and it said that the inflection point was 77%. George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, always talked about 90%, and we would get into trouble if debt to GDP went above 90%. Now it's gone through 100%. But of course, there are other economies in the world that are also in similar ratios or indeed higher. And actually, we're sort of one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios of the G7 countries. So how much debt is too much these days?
Yes, I mean, I do think that the debt levels have exploded quite dangerously, but I don't think that's the worst problem that we face. I think the first thing to look at is the government made a massive gamble, which was this. Should it freeze the economy under the assumption that the attack from the virus would be short-lived and we'd be able to get out of this and back to some kind of normality reasonably quickly? Or should we do what the Americans do, which is basically increase unemployment benefits, but not launch a proper furlough scheme? So, the Americans allowed a lot of people to lose their jobs, a lot of companies to go bankrupt immediately. What we did instead was, and what Sunak did instead was to create this furlough scheme and all of these loans and so on to try and freeze the economy, preserve existing relationships and existing corporate structures, and try, just to get through this intact effectively. And I think at the beginning, it looked like the furlough scheme and the British approach was better. But now that this is clearly going to drag on for another 6 months or even a year, it no longer looks like the way, because we basically froze everything for nothing, because the economy is changing permanently, because we're not getting back to normal, which means there's going to be massive job losses in any case. And we've only the Sunak plan only deferred the pain, it didn't reduce it. So that's the first issue. Where Sunak did do incredibly well, though, was in the state capacity, the delivery, the ability to introduce all these really complicated new IT systems, all these new programs, without the whole system falling over. If you step back a bit, what we've seen during this pandemic is that the UK state is basically useless, right? It can't deliver projects. It's incompetent. The NHS doesn't work, the vaccines don't work, Public Health England doesn't work, and so on and so forth. But one part of the government's body did actually work, and that was the Treasury and even HMRC. The tax credit system worked, universal credit worked, the loans more or less worked, and Liam is right, of course, there's going to be quite a lot of fraud, all those sorts of problems. But in a technical sense, in an IT sense, in a delivery sense, the Treasury side of things actually is the only part of this overall government structure that actually worked. So on that front, Sunak did really, really well. Then it takes us to another one of his flagship policies, which was ease out to help out. Now, at the time, that was incredibly popular. It obviously gave a massive boost to the restaurant industry. The question now, of course, is it doesn't look as clever, given that they're rowing back on restaurants. They're imposing a 10 p.m. curfew on restaurants and pubs. They're even going to force table service only, that sort of stuff. It's pretty disjointed policy making, really. But I think on balance, Sunak's biggest problem is not really his fault. It's that this government lacks an economic vision. It lacks an economic strategy. We don't know where they're going. We don't know what their approach to growing the economy is. We know that they want to spend tons of money on HS2 and other forms of infrastructure. But what is their private sector-led growth strategy? And that is more important than ever now, because forget about a V-shaped recovery. We're not going to get a V-shaped recovery. We're going to get permanent structural change in this economy and a permanent hit, massively increased unemployment, especially with the second set of restrictions being imposed on the economy. So how do you move away from that? How do you get the private sector to grow? How do you get confidence to return? How do you get an entrepreneurial revolution? How do you make the most of this process of creative destruction? And I can't see an answer right now from the government, unfortunately. I can only hear or see social democratic nostrums, a debt to GDP ratio that keeps going up. Taxes are about to go up, and I'm quite worried.
And it strikes me from what you're saying, and going back to what Juliet was saying, that actually Sunak's on the horns of a dilemma here, because furlough worked for a while, but the longer it goes on, the less economically effective it is. But also the longer it goes on, the harder politically it is to row back from it. Would you agree with that, Allister?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with that, which is why I don't actually support any extension of furlough. I support the creation of new schemes to bail out temporarily maybe some of these new sectors, or some of the sectors that are being affected again. But I don't think we shouldn't try to frame freeze the economy anymore, right? The original mission was to effectively put the economy into some sort of coma, keep everything the same for a few months, and then we'd get out of this when a vaccine or something would turn up. The problem is nothing's turning up, and the economy now needs to change. People need to readjust to the new reality, which tragically will mean quite a lot of people are going to lose their jobs over the next few weeks. And if the government wants to smooth this and help people who are losing from this, they need to create targeted help, not the kinds of schemes that pretend that the old order is about to return. And I think, as you say quite rightly, Ben, this has become much more politically difficult because people have got used to free money. They've got used to those sorts of schemes. So Sunak needs a new approach, and he needs it now. And I don't think that means extending furlough as it currently was.
A lot of commentators have talked about how Sunak should move from supporting people. In your view, look like how can Sunak do that? In a sense, we've been preserving the old economy and preserving old jobs. How does he move? How does he transition to a position where he's stimulating the creation of new jobs, essentially, which is what needs to happen now?
Sorry, is that me?
I'm going to answer that. I'm not sure who that was for, but
that was for Jeremy.
I think. Okay, sorry. I will let Jeremy speak in that case.
Yeah, I think, as Allister was saying, there is quite a lot of a merit in the American approach, which is that you have relatively high unemployment benefits rather than paying people to not work effectively. And that strikes me as a better way of dealing with some of the structural issues that Allister was alluding to. It's plain that a lot of the old jobs will go. We need to generate new jobs in tech sectors, in other sectors. That said, I was last week on a break up in Lake District, and many of the hostelries in that area say they have never been busier, ever. And partly that's because of staycations and that kind of phenomenon, but it's also because there is quite a lot of pent-up demand. So you may see quite a lot of the hospitality sector over time shifting away from city centres out into the regions. That'll be a quite healthy development, it seems to me. But it is perfectly true that some of these sectors are going to be permanently impaired, and we do need to start thinking very seriously about where the jobs of the future are going to come from. That is not at all obvious at the moment. Not everybody can be a tech whiz kid. There are plainly going to be a lot more jobs in social care, in education coming through. We need to think very seriously about how these sectors are funded.
I'm just going to come back to that question about debt to GDP and how much debt is too much, because Allister gave a brilliant answer to it, but I'm not sure it was an answer to the question. So, Liam, markets will worry if this spend on ad infinitum. But in the in the global rankings, our GDP debt to GDP is not quite as high as others. So are we gonna see investors quitting the UK?
Well, currency markets in a crisis, they're an ugly baby contest, aren't they? And it's all about not being the ugliest baby in the show. And you're right, Ben, we're not the ugliest baby. We're currently spending something like 40 to 50 billion pounds a year on debt service, government debt service. We can argue about the metaphysics of that, and it is literally metaphysics when the Bank of England's holding quite a lot of the debt and the state's paying itself. An unsustainable situation, in my point of view. So it's all about trying to keep yourself in the middle of the pack. I think it's to the UK's advantage that it's shown in recent memory, the last 10 years, that its political system, mad as it is in many ways, is robust enough to oversee a broad reduction in debt to GDP, albeit from raising the denominator, increasing growth, rather than actually lowering spending. It is all about raising the denominator. But what I'd say is I've detected a very worrying lack of economic literacy in the centre of government, including in number 10. There are people in number 10 who still think the sterling is a reserve currency. I'm not joking. And they have to be told in no uncertain terms that sterling isn't a reserve currency. So we can't be complacent about this at all. And as I've said, we're getting to the point where, in my view, we've been at this point for quite a few years, but this is crystallizing now, where ever more economic stimulus to mollify, financial markets, basically, and the financiers with whom certain people in government and their advisors are so mesmerized, it's completely counterproductive in my view. I spent a couple of days with one of our leading industrialists last week, and he is deciding whether or not to build a new factory and employ thousands more people, and he is completely freaked out at this enormous through the looking glass monetary stimulus that we're now doing. So in that sense, I think mollifying financial markets endlessly, very bloated financial markets, is counterproductive. And in the end, that will start to seep through into the currency. It's all very clever to think, we're taking the edge off our currency and that makes our exports a bit more competitive. But the rope can very quickly slip through your hands. And when you get a falling currency, you get big inflation. And that hurts in the short term and short to medium term in terms of investment and unemployment, and you end up with stagflation. For me, the big variable is the extent to which the government can contain the political fallout from unemployment, and our ability to project to the world a sense of managing our economy and our country more broadly. The Office for Budget Responsibility, Ben, it has long had in its report an unemployment estimate for the current quarter of almost 13%. I've been pretty surprised at the extent to which Fleet Street has accepted this notion that unemployment is just 4 or 5%. But that's unemployment in terms of people who are searching for work. And not many people are searching for work at the moment because of obvious COVID-related reasons. If you look at the claimant count, we're already at almost 9% unemployment before furlough has ended. So I think we're heading, unfortunately, for that was 12.9% was the OBR's estimate before these new lockdown measures and the implications of them on business confidence. Yep. And if we can, there is going to be very high unemployment. The countries that can manage that high unemployment in a way that doesn't lead to lots and lots of political extremism, they'll be the ones that manage to maintain the confidence of financial markets across the world. And obviously, I hope the UK is one of those countries.
Okay, so we've got a budget coming up. So I'm going to do another poll of the viewers, ask another question. In the budget that's coming up, obviously Rishi Sunak has been spending a lot of money. He's been borrowing a lot of money, spending a lot of money. So what should he do now in the next budget, which will be sometime in November? The exact date hasn't been announced. Should he raise taxes? Should he cut spending? Should he do both? Or should he do neither? That's interesting. That's neither. Almost half of people think that he should sit on his hands. Personal belief as well. I think he can know yet quite what the situation is, and to do either of those things could stifle the economy. But Juliet, maybe come to you on the question. It's exactly when it is, but it's probably some point in the next 2 or 3 months. It should be the shortest speech at a budget in recent years.
Well, I think it's probably going to be quite late in winter, November, December time. And I think the main question will be, are we seeing the light at the end of the tunnel? Is there a vaccine that has passed its phase 3 trial? Are we, is the virus vaguely under control to a degree that the government is happy with? And if those things are the case, then I think he's got to basically look at winding up a lot of these schemes, the emergency schemes, and trying to get a handle, trying to get the deficit down from absolutely crazy unsustainable levels to something that's more, vaguely reasonable. So I think, I think raising taxes at that time would be a crazy thing to do. I mean, he may try to signal a couple of stuff the Treasury has always wanted to do, on national insurance or other things that he's mentioned and clearly wants to do, although frankly I think that Boris Johnson, number 10, will put a firm lid on that. I don't think there are going to be any significant tax rises really at all. It's hard to see how he can really do much to plug the deficit, let alone pay down the debt, without crossing many political red lines for the Tories. So I think essentially high debt is here to stay for the rest of this parliament. But I think what he could do is, if we're starting to reach the end of the pandemic, and I think he probably will wait until then to do his budget, then he can start talking about winding up some of these schemes. And what he can also do is some of the things that Allister was talking about with regard to laying out what the hell the vision is for the future of the economy. And, this slogan that Boris talks about, build better, brighter, greener, whatever it is, to put some substance behind that. I suspect that the Prime Minister's instincts are to throw a huge amount of money at building large projects. And so we may see an element of that. But if there, and I think that may work in terms of markets accepting it. If you see a shift from spending day to day to investment type spending, which a lot of economists want to see anyway, then I think he will get away with that. But I think really the ultimate limit on how much the government can spend right now, at least in the era that we're in, is not directly market response, because market response has been essentially swamped by this enormous wave of quantitative easing and money printing. I think it's quadruple the amount we had after the financial crisis. And that's probably never going to be fully wound up, frankly. And the real limiting factor on that is inflation. Right now, we're in a deflationary period because no one can spend any money. So, businesses and prices are being cut to entice us to spend. But what we could see, what I think we probably will see when this is over, is some of the pent-up demand that Jeremy was talking about will be released in a massive way. But at the same time, you will have had a wave of bankruptcies and supply disruption, not least with other things going on, like the trade war with China, supply chains being retooled. And so I think that you will have what you could have potentially is a big rise in demand, a supply shock that makes itself known, which has been sort of quiet at the moment because we're not spending money. And then you could get a big spike in inflation. And that is really where government finances get into trouble. I don't think we'll see that in the forthcoming budget. But I think that is the limiting factor on what the government can do, because essentially they're monetizing all the debt. So the only tension is when you reach a point where the Bank of England is under pressure to raise interest rates to tamp down inflation. And I think what the government would like, or although it would never admit this institutionally, is probably for inflation to bump along at maybe 5% to erode down the debt that we've got ourselves into. But that's a tricky balance to strike, because if it goes too low, then the debt is basically will never be reduced. But if it goes too high, then you panic markets, and then you start to have this dynamic with interest rates going up, and that will be a disaster for debt costs. So for the whole economy as well as for the government. So I think that I think he'll wait until maybe he can do something significant, but I think the longer term dynamics we won't quite see playing out until later next year, probably.
Allister, same question for you. I see from Rishi Sunak at the budget when it happens.
Yes, I mean, look, I think the most of the readers who said he should do nothing are right. In the short term, he should do nothing. There should not be tax increases. That in particular would be totally crazy. I think we can't just look at this whole situation or this whole question in the abstract. One needs to look at where the trends are going. Even before this crisis, the tax to GDP ratio was at a multi-decade high, right? It was the highest it's been for decades. By the end of this crisis, the tax to GDP ratio is going to be at its highest level since Attlee was Prime Minister. This is a really, really bad development. It's going to cripple the economy. And this goes back to the question you asked originally, Ben, which I didn't deliberately not answer, which was about the GDP ratio. And I think, to me personally, the tax to GDP ratio is far more important than the debt to GDP ratio. And also things like the public spending to GDP ratio. These are very important determinants of long-term economic growth, as well as other things such as, entrepreneurial creation, private sector investment, and so on. And, we need a country with a clear philosophy. We're about to leave the European Union. Those of us who advocated leaving the European Union, and obviously still do so, such as myself, were always very clear that this has to come with a very coherent pro-growth strategy. You can have different kinds of pro-growth strategies, but simply saying that you are now a believer in the green economy and you're going to ban all petrol cars and you're going to build HS2 for 200-300 billion and you're going to do another, those kinds of things. Well, that is not a growth strategy. This is not going to pay the bills. This is not going to boost GDP per capita. This is not going to boost salaries. This is not going to create jobs. It's a disaster. We need a pro-growth strategy. And the virus is flushing out, and the reaction to the virus, the lockdowns, the restrictions that are being imposed today, are flushing out parts of the economy. Unfortunately for the UK, they are parts of the economy at which we were especially successful. We've been very successful in recent years at creating tons and tons of jobs in the hospitality sector, for example, right? Lots of those sorts of jobs. That's why unemployment was so low. Now all of these jobs are being wiped away. What's going to happen? So we need a coherent strategy. I think Sunak is a brilliant man. He's exceptional. Of all the members of the cabinet, he stands out. And he understands all of this stuff. But he is constrained by massive political problems. Primarily that the Prime Minister is obsessed with spending money We should have been fine had there been no pandemic, but suddenly, we've just increased the debt to GDP ratio by 25%. So already there's more constraints here. It's not all about spending. It has to be about how the private sector can drive growth. And that's really my worry. But I think when the budget does come, it has to be a pro-growth budget. It cannot be a pure fiscal consolidation budget. It cannot, absolutely mustn't be, a massive tax hiking budget.
Okay, so Alistair's mentioned the B word there. He's mentioned Brexit. So
I had to throw all that in.
Of course. One of the questions I wanted to ask is whether the pandemic makes it more or less likely that the UK makes a success of Brexit. Because on the one hand, obviously, it's taking up the focus of a lot of our politicians' time. But on the other hand, there's perhaps the opportunity to refashion our economy. So Liam, maybe I can go to you with that question. Do you think that the pandemic could be turned into an opportunity?
It could be, but with the amount of human suffering going on as we announce new lockdown measures, to talk about it in those terms wouldn't be the best political strategy at this point. There's word from the centre that there may actually not be a budget in November. While I share Alistair's view that it should be very much a do-nothing budget in a fiscal sense, agreeing with the 43% of viewers, to not show up, I think, would be seen in the same vein as when a PLC delays an audit. And to have no common set-piece announcement when you said that there will be one, just as we're leaving the European Union in a legal sense, would again look like a big abrogation of responsibility. I think I agree with Alistair, and even wrote a book on this subject, that when you do Brexit, it's an opportunity to implement pro-growth measures. And Rishi Sunak is, of all the people in the cabinet, the person who has, as a backbencher, articulated that most coherently. His CPS, Centre for Policy Studies pamphlet on free ports is still well worth a read. Let's hope that some of that sentiment makes it into policy-making circles. It may be that if we look at the global economy, and we haven't looked at that much in this world of pandemic and with a big global slump, will that make it more or less likely that we'll have more protectionism going forward? There are some historic precedents that when you're faced with a global economic slowdown, that's when trade deals are actually done, because it focuses everyone's mind as we look down the barrel of recession. And it just to branch it out a little bit, the last time we did a call like this, myself and colleagues were talking a lot about the US-China trade war, and it's been mentioned today as well. If you actually look at the numbers, Ben, and you look at a report from the Kiel Institute that's just come out, very good source of trade data, US-China bilateral trade is actually, in August, it was back where it was in August 2019 in terms of freight shipments. Global trade is now very, very sharply recovering and is almost back to normal levels. We are a trading nation. Brexit is all about increasing the amount of trade that we do, particularly outside the European Union, even though we already do the majority of our trade outside the European Union. So amidst all the political angst and our focus on the UK, there are some at least moderately promising signs in terms of the global economy. And as the UK does look outward, perhaps we can tap into that. I just thought I'd put that little bit of optimism in there to cheer people
up. Jeremy, maybe I can turn to you on that question about Brexit and whether this pandemic makes it easier or harder to pull off a successful Brexit.
Yeah, I just want to echo some of what Liam says. I think there is a danger of getting into too pessimistic a state of mind in the depths of a crisis. I mean, there are some sectors at the moment that are positively booming financial services, tech, professional services, for instance. All these industries have never been busier. And that's partly due to government largesse, of course, and the central bank money printing, which we've referred to. But it does give some reason to believe that there is an economy the other side of this crisis. As for Brexit, plainly, it doesn't help to be doing this at a time of when you're in a global pandemic and the economy is going down the pan in the way it has been. We're approaching the end of the year, the end of the transition. There's either going to be no deal or there's going to be a deal. To be honest, the difference between the two in economic terms is going to be pretty marginal. Most of the modelling suggests that after 10 years, the difference between a Canadian-style deal and no deal is about 1 to 2% of GDP, which is, in the scheme of things, not very large over 10 years. So I don't think we need to worry too much about that. But I think there is a danger that we've alluded to here, and Liam talked about it, in terms of the weak point in our economy is we see it in the currency. Now, if we come out of the European Union with no deal, our exports to the European Union are going to suffer, at least in the short term. So our trade deficit will widen. That has to be funded by foreign investors in some shape or form. They're beginning to lose faith in the UK economy. They will demand a higher interest rate for lending to us. And regardless of what the Bank of England does to hold down rates, market rates will rise. So there is a danger of people forget that currency crises, well, we've not had a currency crisis since the RM, basically. But they can happen. At the moment, we're in a situation where everybody is doing the same thing the world over. There's nowhere for investors to run. Everybody is printing money. Everybody is running huge deficits, and so on and so forth. But if you've got the thought at the back of investors' minds that Brexit piles one kind of problem on top of another, then they may begin to discriminate against the UK. So it's a dangerous point for us, and it's going to require some very careful handling, I think, over the months ahead.
Great. I'm going to turn to some of the viewers' questions that have been coming in thick and fast, and just remind you, if you want to ask a question of the panel, please submit one now, because we're going to use our remaining time to go through these. There's one question here from Anna Harding. We've been talking about how Sunak should maybe follow the US model in terms of jobs. She's asking how feasible that is. And isn't it the US model fundamentally more flexible in terms of labour law and hiring? So maybe Juliet, I come to you on that one. Do you think that Sunak can do what we were suggesting earlier, which is to adopt a more US model, or is the system in the UK too rigid to allow for that?
No, I don't think he can, in the sense that it will involve enormous mass unemployment, which, we may be headed for anyway. But I think that, he may be able to, by winding up certain parts of the furlough scheme and not winding up other parts, I think he can adjust the way the scheme works. That in itself is going to be quite a controversial thing to do, because they'll essentially be picking parts of the economy that he thinks are worthy of giving them a chance to recover. Although it obviously makes sense, if you're going to shut down the hospitality industry, then you have to give them a chance to then recover rather than go bankrupt. But I think that politically, for him to, essentially it would also be packaged with probably quite a big rise in benefits, and I'm not sure that the Tory party itself wants to go in that direction. So I think politically it would be very difficult for him to do that.
Okay, we've got another question here. This is Foden. He's saying, isn't the real tragedy here the lack of competence? I've touched on this, the panelists in this, talking about the strategy and the lack of a sense of direction. Would you agree with that this doesn't really have the big ideas to maybe pull us out of this crisis?
Who was that for?
That was for Jeremy. Sorry, I think my internet's breaking up a little bit. But Jeremy, do you think the government lacks big ideas?
I think too much store is put by big ideas myself. I mean, you collect the world's biggest brains, and they come up with a series of different big ideas, and they don't really add up to a hill of beans, when it comes down to it. At the moment, Sunak's job is basically just to manage this crisis as best he can. The question of whether you put the emphasis on being a low-tax economy, small state economy, or a big state, high-tax economy, well, the Tory party have yet basically to decide where they stand on this. We seem to be at a juncture where the old Thatcherite idea of low tax, small state is giving way to a much more interventionist, bigger state approach. Maybe that's the way they go. Who knows? But at the moment, the challenge is simply to come out of the other side of this crisis in reasonably good shape, and that's where Sunak has to be concentrating. Big ideas, let the think tanks come up with some good ideas and we'll think about them.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple questions here. We've got Watley. He's saying, is it a problem that the UK economy is over-reliant on financial services? And Natalie Varley has asked whether it would be better for the government to start investing in other sectors, investing in aerospace, shipbuilding, etc., to stimulate the economy. So I suppose if you combine those two questions, come to you, Allister, should the government be trying to remodel the economy? Should it be using this opportunity to make investments in sectors that have perhaps been underappreciated in recent history?
I'm less interested in that. I don't really believe in picking sectors, basically. I think it's too difficult. Other than in the most general terms, which is, of course, we are, developed economies need to specialize in high value added areas. So in that sense, what you want is an economy where people who want to operate in those areas, or companies that want to operate in those areas, find it easy. Maybe because there's a very good education system, because there's a great set of universities that specialize in science, that sort of stuff. So in that respect, I support that, but I don't support picking sectors, and I definitely don't support picking individual companies. I think down that road lies disaster every single time. And given the incompetence of the British state, I can't see how that can change anytime soon. Instead, what I support is an economy where there are far more people who want to set up their own businesses and far more people who want to grow these businesses, and an economy where companies and individuals who want to make investments decide that they want to come here. I think we need to be a much more attractive economy in all those areas. I think we need to encourage entrepreneurship. In the 80s, after some of those recessions, especially the one in the early 80s, the government deliberately encouraged people to set up their own businesses, and I think it had similar schemes after the following recession. I think we need to go down that road again. I think there needs to be a massive encouragement. We need to encourage people to set up more companies. Far more people need to set up more companies. A lot of the people who are going to be losing or have already lost their jobs will need to set up their own businesses rather than hope to find a job working for somebody else. And I think that would be a much healthier way to do this, and that requires far lower taxes, improved incentives, and so on. And it is not compatible with a social democratic state when it comes to public spending, right? The paradox of Boris is that we could end up becoming a continental style economy when it comes to public spending and debt and tax and so on as a share of GDP. But the reality is those countries have not done well economically over the past few decades. And, we mustn't fall into that trap. So we need to get back to basics. We shouldn't focus on individual sectors. We shouldn't focus on individual companies other than in the generality of saying, obviously, tech and science and professional services and finance and all those kinds of areas are bound to grow and we should encourage them. Apart from that, we shouldn't try and pick winners, and we should instead try and create the most dynamic economy possible.
A very interesting question from Trevor Pittman here. He's asking whether debt write-offs are plausible. Liam, I'm going to come to you on this. You said that the government is essentially paying itself via the Bank of England. You described it as being almost metaphysical. Do you think that there would be a mechanism by which those debts could be written off? And I'll add a question of my own to that, which is, do you think that the way the Bank of England has been used by the Treasury has compromised, or how they behaved through this crisis has compromised the independence of the Bank of England?
Lots of questions there. There's an earlier question, is finance too dominant in the UK economy? Yes, it is. Most engineers from our top universities go and design derivatives. It doesn't do society much good, in my view. So I think we are too dependent on finance. I'd counter Jeremy. I do think ideas are very, very important. Leadership is very, very important. When everyone's got big debts and all economies are struggling, that kind of soft stuff, that vision thing can actually matter more than ever. These animal spirits are very, very important. I want a government that's talking about helping small and medium-sized enterprises, moving away from always kowtowing to big business, serious competition policy that boosts growth. All this comes from intellectual debate and discussion. I agree, it can sometimes seem a bit vapid, but I think that kind of stuff is really, really important. When markets really lose faith in what policymakers everywhere are doing, I think the euro will, come to the fore as a very, very bad idea. And the Eurozone, has massive political divisions, massive economic incoherence, a huge number of systemically important, deeply unstable banks. That's a really good reason to get out of the European Union fully by the end of the year. But to come to the question at hand, Ben, I think Juliet characteristically touched on the important point here. Central banks around the world are going to have some kind of debt jubilee among themselves and with each other, if you like, because a lot of the quantitative easing is just of such a scale that it can never be properly unwound. There's going to have to be some kind of showing my age here, some kind of a modern day Plaza Accord, where the big central banks, including the UK, get together and fess up what's happened and kind of put it behind us in some way. That will warp bond markets even more going forward, and it will undermine the ability of the Western world, and this is largely a Western phenomenon, to borrow cheaply going forward, and our children and our grandchildren will pay the costs of that. At the moment, financial markets, again, particularly in the West, is kind of like an Indian rope trick. It's like a Ponzi scheme, and all objective, serious analysts can see that, but very, very few people want to talk about it because the implications of facing up to it are so large. But that is where we are. And again, this comes down to ideas. The cardinal importance of independent central banking. Mervyn King, much maligned by financial commentators and their friends in the city, but Mervyn King's been talking about this very coherently in recent months. I do think something has been lost. I do think a lot of the intellectual and policy making progress that we've made since the bad old days of the 70s and early 80s has been reversed, and there will be a price paid for that going forward. And I do think, Ben, as you intimate, there will need to be some kind of reckoning moment where, rather than just ignoring what's happening financially and conceptually on central bank balance sheets, we have to bring it out into the open and talk about and discuss and debate what we've actually done since the 2008 financial crisis, and the merits and otherwise of the policies that we've conducted.
Probably got time for one last question. Juliet, I'm going to come to you with this. It's from Gareth Edwards. It's slightly off topic, but very topical. He's asking about the US elections and whether a Trump or a Biden presidency would be better for Britain. So, Juliet, what's your view on that? Would you vote Trump or Biden?
To give a very quick answer to the previous question, on debt write-offs, I mean, I think there will be, but it will be via inflation. So I don't think there will be a big dramatic write-off. It will just be, eroded away over time. The US election, I think that, domestically, I think the US is in a huge cultural mess. I basically I have a different view as to what might be best for the US domestically. I think probably in terms of the UK, probably a Trump presidency would be better, because I think that I wouldn't endorse the way he's gone about it, but I think some of the reckoning that he is bringing about with China is hugely in our interest. I think you saw that with the whole Huawei debacle, where UK institutions are essentially now unable to recognize what is in our strategic and economic interests, and it took the US forcing us to do that in order for us to make a decision that was in our interests. So I think that's just one example, but I think and then there's the whole Brexit issue. I think a lot of this talk about the Irish border and a trade deal is a bit overblown, and it's probably ahead of US elections, both sides trying to appeal to, especially the Democratic side, appeal to some of their Irish constituencies. But I do think that politically it's it's more in Trump's interests to, it's more along the lines of his instincts to sign some sort of trade deal. Now, I don't think the substance of that will massively change between a Biden or Trump presidency, because once US negotiators get their mandate, then they will be extremely tough, and the country's interests won't massively change depending on who's president. But I think that just the political mood music will be more positive under a Trump presidency. But I think more broadly that it's more in our interests that the US, as the world's great democracy and beacon of freedom, manages to sort its domestic cultural and political toxic problems. I think that's actually long-term in our greater interests. And I think that I'm not sure that a continued Trump presidency, especially on a narrow margin, would be very good for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Juliet. I think we've come to the end of our hour. So I'd just like to thank all the panelists, Allister, Jeremy, Juliet, and Liam. Thank you all for tuning in and watching. Apologies for the internet. I know that it wasn't great throughout that. I'm broadcasting from darkest Surrey, which may have caused some of the problems. But thank you very much for bearing with us and for watching and for sending some excellent questions. If you want to watch this session later, it will be on the Telegraph's live YouTube channel, so you can catch up on it there. But for now, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.